Interwar Japan. So we'll start with the dates plus the expansion of Japan, and then I'll touch upon Japan from a domestic perspective. I didn't really do Japan in detail in the IB, but I did read a few books on the subject. So yeah, I've got that covered to fill in the holes beyond the Manchurian Crisis. So there's a lot of dates I listed, right? But basically, in 1890, Japan's constitution goes into effect, and we can see that Japan is pretty much an expansion state, right? A militarist state. In 1904, we have the Russo-Japanese War. By 1910, Japan annexes Korea, and then we have the Mutin incident in 1931, one of the core incidents that the IB always likes to focus on. And then, so yeah, that's worth focusing on specifically. So, in 1931, a group of Japanese middle-ranking officers blow up a railway in Manchuria. And then they blame it on Chinese rebels and use it as a pretext to intervene in Manchuria. Now, there's already a lot of Japanese citizens living in Manchuria. That's one thing that's important to consider. And there's also a lot of, Japan already has a lot of influence there, business, military, etc. But this is as a pretext to invade from Korea. Of course, a general had to sign off on this, but the generals didn't want to appear like they lost control over the army and what the middle-ranking officers were doing, and they were also sympathetic to their nationalism, so they went ahead. And then the civilian government, which did not support the policy towards Manchuria, well, basically they didn't really have control over the army, so they didn't want to appear weak, and they also, weren't really willing to go up against the army, so they gave their official approval, despite disapproving after the fact was already done. So, with this case, we can see the general collapse of Japanese democracy. Because for the first 35 years after the Meiji Constitution was enacted, Japan was actually democratizing, right? In 1912, the Prime Minister, because under the Constitution, right, we had, first of all, the Emperor at the top, but he rarely made any major decisions, and under him was the Diet, or basically Japan's parliament, so the civilian government, and we had the military, which itself was split up between the army and the navy, which were equals. And for the first 35 years, the civilian government is firmly the most important one, and the country is democratizing. In 1912, a decision is made that the prime minister is not appointed by, let's say, the Council of Elder Statesmen, that was kind of instrumental into developing modern Japan. Rather, it was decided that the leader of the largest party in the Diet would become the prime minister. So there was that major change. And over time, the franchise is extended. In 1890, only 500,000 people could vote out of a population of 70 million in Japan proper. If we add Japan's imperial territories by the beginning of by 1937, they would account for 110 million. But leaving that behind, proper Japan has 70 million people. By 1925, that number had grown to 3 million. And in 1925, a law is passed which basically extends universal suffrage to all men. So all 35 million men can vote. However, for the last 20 years, we have a downfall of this democracy. And first of all, why? Why was there this militarization? Why was the army able to gain more power over time? First of all, we have the nationalist population. The Japanese people were very nationalistic, very militaristic, very willing to support the military and expand throughout this period. And this was despite the fact that they were generally supporting democracy, and Japan was moving towards democracy, and a lot of Western norms and values were being adopted, we can say. The people were still highly nationalistic, just like in Germany or Italy, for instance, right? And then we also had the military itself was very radicalized, because the military drew most of its career soldiers from the rural population, and the rural areas were not as impacted by these changes in tradition, and For all of these people, the army was, the only sort of world that they ever knew. And they grew increasingly radical, increasingly nationalistic, loyal to the emperor, and a lot of these people made it to mid-officer ranks. And they basically started seeing everybody who was moderate as a traitor. For example, the reason why Admiral Yamamoto was kept during World War II as Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, deployed overseas and not kept on the General Staff in Japan, was largely because it was feared that he would be assassinated as a moderate by some radical officers if they didn't do that. But anyway, these radical officers, first of all, they get a lot of sympathy from equally nationalistic but more moderate and rational leaders higher up. But, as they start purging people, they gain more power, and they target both the military and the civilian government. So, we saw their influence on the Mutin Crisis, and in 1932, they effectively, basically assassinated the Prime Minister Inukai, and the director of Mitsui, which was one of the biggest Japanese companies at the time. One of the four major corporations, which was, giant, pretty much spanned every industry, and worked very closely with the government. Out of all of these, Mitsubishi is the one which is most remembered today, and is still a significant Japanese company which you see everywhere. But anyway, at this somewhere around this point, democracy just basically effectively collapsed. It was basically going downhill ever since the military was gaining more power, but at this point it collapses. And unfortunately, the Japanese military government became increasingly radical. Because now when we go back to the civilian-military divide, the military has the upper hand. The effective government of Japan is made up of 6 people. The Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, who is a representative of the Emperor, then the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of the Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Chief of Staff of the Navy, and the Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister is, in actuality, always a military officer, usually a general or an admiral. So we have 5 military members plus a representative of the emperor. For a while, you had the foreign policy minister, but he was basically subordinated to these people. And you also had the Minister of Finance working on this cabinet-esque organization. But to show but this is actually a good example of the radicalization and basically separation from reality of this Japanese radical elite, because after the Minister of Finance explained why there wasn't enough money to sustain and arm an additional 3 divisions, they basically just threw him off the cabinet and went through with the plan anyway. So yeah, democracy effectively collapses into military rule, despite the fact that the civilian government is still technically officially in charge of civilian matters, and that the emperor is still above everybody. So, looking into the details of the Mutin Crisis, right? Because this is the thing that's going to very likely pop up on paper 1. In 1931, we had that Mutin Crisis, which I explained, and the League of Nations in 1932 establishes the Leiten Commission under a guy named Leiten, that was his last name, to travel to Manchuria and make a report to figure out whether Japanese claims are true and what should be done. This was a both slow and fast process. It was fast because these officials were assembled relatively quickly and sent relatively quickly and got to work relatively quickly, but it was too slow because by the time they were done, it was too late. But unfortunately, it took 2 weeks to gather all these important officials. It took a few weeks to steam all the way to Manchuria from London. And then, consider this giant size of Manchuria. It required basically years. Sorry, not years, but basically a huge amount of time to gather information over such a large territory. And by the time the League of Nations accepted the Leiten Commission report, it was already 1933. They agreed with the decision, and they told Japan to leave Manchuria, which Japan had turned into a puppet state under a Chinese emperor, and the state is called the state Manchukuo. But Japan, instead of leaving Manchuria, decided to leave the League of Nations instead. And then we'll see this continued radicalization, 1936, the 226 incident, an attempt to overthrow the government by a radical faction of the army, despite the fact that the army was already effectively in charge. And then in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. So the Second Sino-Japanese War, the invasion of China. Now, some will argue that this was the beginning of World War I in Asia, but some see the Sino-Japanese War as a separate war, which would become part of World War II only after Pearl Harbor, and see 1941 as the actual start of the Pacific War. So the actual start is debated. Basically, you can go with either one. You could actually even argue that all of World War II began in 1937, but the problem with this is that 1939 is the standard date. So you would have to explain this to the IB in like a sentence or two, which is basically a waste of time, and you just shouldn't do it. 1939, the IB will accept that date without any issue. So even if you think that 1937 is a better date, there's no point wasting your time and words to prove that point. Yeah. So I added there's some more dates which are more relevant to World War to World War II and the emergence of hostilities between Japan and America, and specifically the American response to Japan. But I'll skip out on that because it's not integral to what we're discussing. But let's also focus on some other key ideas, right? So it's important to this highly nationalist population, right, which I said was democratizing. There was also very limited opposition to the military in general among this population, despite the fact that they were pro-democratic to a large part, and we saw, very moderate people being voted into the Diet even during World War II by these nationalist people. But nobody was willing to challenge the establishment openly. Pretty much the same case as in Stalin's Soviet Union or as in Hitler's Germany. The exception was primarily the Japanese communists, but they were not a major force. Then there was the fact that Japan was really behind the US and much of Europe in terms of industry. Don't get me wrong, Japanese industry developed very quickly and was among the leading industries in the world, but they just really couldn't compete with Germany or the United States or Great Britain in terms of technical capability and the scale of production. And also we need to consider that outside of Japan's radicalization and nationalism, there were also some strategic reasons for expanding. First of all, Japan had very poor access to natural resources. Japanese iron is basically very poor, so they needed to import iron from abroad. That's actually one of the reasons why katanas were folded so many, because Japanese iron was just of very low quality in Japan, unfortunately. They also needed to import oil, they needed to import rubber, and they even needed to import food, because when the population exploded, they needed to get that food from Manchuria and that food from Korea to sustain their population at home. And there was also this military thinking about this line of advantage. So everybody on the outside was seen as a threat. The United States, a future enemy, undoubtedly. So were the British. The Russians were already beaten, but the Soviets would be a threat, definitely. That's what they're thinking. But a war could not be fought on the industrial base, because the industrial base was needed to create the material that Japan needed to fight. So the war had to be fought on territory where there was nothing important. So initially Korea. But after Korea became industrialized, that was pushed onto Manchuria. And similarly, this line also extended into the Pacific along the islands. So there was also this extent of military strategy, which pushed Japanese expansionism. And was supported even by the moderates and more reasonable people. But what I think is important, there are some key questions that we have to ask ourselves. First of all, was Japan fascist? I do not recommend bringing up Japan as an example of a fascist country for the IB, because it's and definitely as a one-party state, because it's very debatable whether Japan was fascist. If we take a definition which focuses on foreign policy, so attempting to gain autarky, so not being reliant on their state for your own survival and resources and stuff. So that's one thing, right? If you consider militarism, extreme nationalism, racial prejudice, the Japanese consider themselves to be a superior race as well at this point, then yes, Japan was fascist with these fascist policies. But if you believe that fascism requires a central one-party state with this, fascist ideology for running the economy, running politics, then not really, because Japan was basically controlled by a military clique. It retained an emperor. There wasn't this party leader figure to emerge. Tojo did try to create a one-party system during the war, but this didn't really succeed. They weren't able to replicate Nazi Germany's one-party state. So if you take that definition of looking at Japan and its inner workings, and Japan was not fascist. So this is very debatable. And another key question was, how much did the Japanese support the militarized society? We know that they were nationalistic, but a lot of Japanese people really supported democracy, and we could see that they voted for moderate politicians, and that they didn't worship the emperor like some sort of god. Like, or at least, when the United States ran a survey after World War II to see what the Japanese were thinking about during surrender, only 3% listed anything related to the emperor as one of the reasons. And the Japanese police received some troubling reports about, very low willingness to fight in late war Japan. Perhaps it was that, the Japanese weren't really in support, but they were unwilling to resist. But this is also true for Stalin's Soviet Union and his dictatorship, or for Nazi Germany. So yeah, we have to remember that, despite of course there being significant the differences in ways of thinking or basic philosophies between Japan and the United States or Germany, at the end of the day people are very similar to each other. There were still people trying to make a profit, bring up the commerce. There was a lot of entrepreneurs in Japan, despite the fact that traditional Japanese aristocrats thought that this was not the character of Japanese society. As a matter of fact, after World War II, Japanese high officials, just like Nazi officials, they killed themselves, they committed suicide at about the same rate, so most of them didn't, and they basically plundered the government, just like the Nazis. There wasn't this higher loyalty to the Japanese people that propaganda would often make you believe. There's also an extent of American propaganda because the Americans, in order to build up Japan as an ally and a positive image of Japan after World War II, really doubled down on presenting the Japanese to the American people as people who were misled and brainwashed by these, vile elites, and how they were influenced by these different, Eastern ideologies, how they had simply not been exposed to the truth of democracy, despite this not being true because Japan had been an effective democracy in the 1920s. Alright, so that's my section on Japan.